Welcome to Rainy Day Recess, a podcast about Seattle Public Schools and the forces that impact the district out in the world. I'm Christie Robertson.
And I am Megan Larkin. This is our last episode of the session for the Big Three Briefing series, tracking the Washington State Legislature through the 2025 legislative session.
Let's lay out the through line for this episode.
Yes. First of all, we hope to come back later to talk to you about where we go from here. But we decided to focus this episode on giving you all the lowdown on where things landed at the end of the legislative session.
Yeah, so the 2025 Washington State legislative session is officially over. Sunday, April 27th was what they call sine die. And I looked it up and it literally means without a day, which I think means that there's no other days in the legislative session.
Yeah, they are out of session indefinitely because they may get called back at any moment, which I suppose, given how chaotic the general landscape is out in the world right now, that's always on the table.
Yeah, but for now, everybody has gone home and is taking a break before they start all of their interim planning.
Yes. Oh, gosh. This was the painful, intense, and just incredibly tough session. I spoke with a legislator who was like, this is maybe the toughest in history that he's ever seen. So, yeah, this was a very challenging environment.
So, Megan, I've been hearing from listeners saying, okay, we've been following, and just, so what happened? What happened in the end? So that's what we're hoping to cover in this episode.
Yes. And I suppose a good caveat to add to that is there's still, as we're recording this, a pile of bills that are sitting on the governor's desk awaiting signature. And those bills include the budget. So until the governor has signed it and this stuff has been implemented, the session could still have some twists and turns.
And our special ed and our MSOC bills are still unsigned?
They are, but from everything that I've been hearing, they're going to be signed. Like 5263, our beloved Senate special education bill sponsored by Jamie Peterson and John Braun. We're all expecting that to be signed and to become law.
And 5192 is also on the governor's desk. And the governor also has line item veto. We're not expecting anything unexpected there, right?
No. Though This session has been wild. New legislators, new governor, crazy environment. So I hesitate to say anything for sure.
Okay, so our plan today is to start with an overview of education funding and then dig into the details. And the overview is that our legislature failed to meet its constitutional duty.
Yes. In the specific language of our state constitution, it is the paramount duty of the state to make ample provision for the education of all children residing within its borders, without distinction or preference on account of race, color, caste, or sex.
And according to various online dictionaries I looked at, paramount means more important than anything else, supreme.
Yes. The legislature failed to meet its constitutional duty to fund special education.
Yep. Special education comprises the services that disabled kids require to access their basic education. And school districts are required by law to provide these services. All put together, districts were underwater on special education by $559 million for the year. Seattle itself is behind by more than $113 million versus its state allocation. And those numbers come from the Association of Educational Service Districts tool that we have mentioned various times before, and we will link to in the show notes.
Backing all of this up with data is a big part of our advocacy. So that's why we are using numbers and we're linking you to these tools because it's really important to be able to show just how underwater a lot of our districts are.
Yeah, so in total for the state, $559 million underwater for special education. And what did they fund, Megan?
The state provided $309 $0.6 million in new money for special education for the next biennium, or approximately $155 million a year. It's closer than in any of the other big three areas, and a little more than we expected when 5263 got voted out of the House, but it's still not a whole lot. As we mentioned, it is the paramount duty of the state to amply fund basic education. This includes special education, and instead they've provided funding for roughly a quarter of the funding gap that exists. It's the state's job to fill that entire gap.
Yeah. And they failed to do that for special education. The legislature also failed to meet their constitutional duty to fund MSOC, what we call keep the lights on money, materials, supplies, and operating costs. That includes things like insurance and utilities that there's very little, if any, wiggle room for districts to spend on.
Yes. Statewide, districts are short around $614 million on MSOC just for last year. Seattle is short about $13 million for MSOC. That's just for last year.
Altogether, the state increased to MSOC spending, ended up at $78.9 million, again, over the biennium. So half of that for this coming year. So the state has pledged to cover about 6.5% of the gap that districts are facing in MSOC. And for a lot of districts, that money won't even cover the increases to their insurance premiums, which have skyrocketed in recent years.
Yes.
And what about transportation, Megan? What percent of the $89.6 million statewide transportation gap was filled by the legislature?
That is 0%.
Oh, yeah. 0.
0% of that gap was filled either by a new bill with policy or by budget provisos. Nothing new for transportation, unfortunately.
Oftentimes, legislators will try to get advocates off their backs by saying, oh, we'll do a budget proviso. And that was teased throughout the session for transportation. It did not come to fruition.
It did not. And that's notable because in previous years where that transportation gap still existed, we at least got a budget proviso for special passengers. But I don't believe that's the case this year.
Okay, so let's sum it all up.
So about a quarter of the special ed funding gap is met. Maybe 6 or 7% of the MSOC gap is covered, and then 0% of the transportation gap.
So all told, the state has allocated about $388.5 million toward the big three funding gap for the biennium.
And that gap itself is conservatively estimated at $2.26 billion.
So we're like throwing $400 million at a $2 billion problem is maybe a good high-level way to think about it. And you might say, oh, well, but this is a budget deficit year. But the truth is that the legislature actually increased their total spending this year. And the increase to K-12 was less than the increase in other areas. And so the percentage of the operating budget spent on education actually went down by 0.2 percentage points. It was 43.4%, and now it's 43.2%.
Yes. So because the size of the budget itself went up, it looks like K through 12 spending went up a lot, but it didn't. A lot of that is maintenance spending. Very little of that is new money. That leads us into a conversation about posturing. It's very important that we do not let our legislators take a victory lap, which is a tricky line to walk, right? Because we don't want to say that nothing was accomplished or invalidate anybody's hard work. And also, we can't let legislators say things like, we made a significant investment in education because A, that's not true, but B, if people start believing that, it becomes even more difficult to get that money next session. So, no victory laps.
Yep. And no victory laps for Governor Ferguson. Starting with his inaugural address, he's emphasized that we have to increase the percentage of our budget devoted to K-12 education. But then between his inaugural address and the end of session, Ferguson did not jump into the K-12 discussion at all. He kind of ignored K-12. And then he stated on April 27th that the budgets adopted by the legislature accomplished those goals. No, 43.4% to 43.2% is not an increase.
Yeah. He also stated that K-12 should be 50% of the budget at one point. And I feel confident that it's not that. Here's what the Big Three Coalition has to say about what happened in the 2025 Washington legislative session. In a letter, which was actually penned by Washington State PTA's lobbyist, Marie Sullivan, and dated April 23rd. We'll link it in the show notes. They had some really powerful thoughts to share, and I will read some of them. On behalf of our membership organizations and members from across the state, we are expressing our disappointment and frustration with what looks like the legislature's lack of significant investments in your public schools and the state's 1.1 million students this session. This year, the education community came together, united behind the Big Three: MSOC, special education, and transportation. These are not new investments, but are the foundational costs to running schools and supporting our students with disabilities. The session began with strong bills and historic investments in both chambers on the Big Three. And as the months ticked by, we saw those efforts narrowed and the dollars invested become less and less. We know you are exhausted. This has been one of the hardest sessions in history. But this will not be the year to declare victory. It is not the year to promote historic investments in K-12 education funding in your newsletters back home, while your districts are determining which additional cuts they will make without the basic education dollars they were counting on. As you close the books on this painful legislative session, know that we will be back with the expectation that the legislature will embrace and fulfill its paramount duty to amply and adequately fund public schools. We stand ready to work with you to ensure that every student has the tools, services, and support to thrive, and that our school districts achieve financial stability. And for clarity, the we in this letter is the Big Three Coalition.
And the Big Three Coalition is really kind of an historic advocacy achievement. And you said it's taken a couple of years to pull together, right?
Yeah, the education advocacy community tends to be kind of disparate because we're big. We've got a lot of busy people. So there's WASDA, which is the school board directors, WASA, the administrators, Washington State PTA, which is largely parents and school communities, the Association of Washington Principals, the Association of the Educational Service Districts, and even more folks. Everybody has their own priorities, and it's very easy to pick people off and pit them against each other. And traditionally, that's what's happened a lot with education advocacy. So I was so excited to hear that all of the various legislative consultants got together and hatched this plan to form this Big Three Coalition. And they're serious about it. I think they even have bracelets. So yeah, this was a big deal because message discipline is a huge factor in making progress advocacy-wise.
Yeah, so Megan and I have been discussing this a lot, and we have some thinking to do, as does everybody. This coalition was a historic achievement. The grassroots organizing this year was monumental. We did achieve message unity. We had legislators who knew what MSOC was. They all knew what the Big Three was. So what gives?
Yeah. I mean, that is an excellent question, and we are going to save that for another episode after we all take long naps and get some emotional distance from this. But we would love to hear your thoughts as we ponder.
At big3@rainydayrecess.org. So now we're going to dive into the details for those who have been following all along and want to know about specifically what happened with special education, MSOC, and transportation, and some of the other bills we've talked about. If you don't want to hear the nitty-gritty, you can tune out now.
It's about to get nitty-gritty in here.
It's about to get nitty-gritty. Okay, what happened in special education? The cap. So probably among the best news of this session was the removal of the special education cap. That is the limit on the number of disabled kids that the state will fund to get their basic education. That cap started out around like 12.5%, and it's inched up over the years. This year, it is 16%. And more energy has built around the effort to remove the cap. And more messaging about how completely offensive and ridiculous it is to have that cap.
Yeah, because it is. It's ridiculously offensive.
Went back and forth for a while, but we finally got everybody to agree. And it's there. The cap removal is in the budget.
Yes. I think this is something that everybody in the education advocacy community should take a minute to feel really good about. It's more of a moral victory than a financial one. I think scrapping the cap generates about $81 million statewide in new funding over the biennium. But it's still a really important victory. And I really don't think that this would have happened without all of our advocacy efforts. It took a lot of people working together for a lot of years to do this, and that work has finally paid off. And, congratulations. Everyone should be feeling good about the cap getting removed.
Also, a huge thanks to Representative Jerry Paulette from the 46, who has championed this concept for years.
Yes. And a huge thank you to Jamie Peterson from the 43rd, and John Braun, who is the Senate Minority Leader out of Centralia. They were the prime sponsors of 5263 and have been pushing this and K-12 in general being a priority in the Senate. So a big shout out to Paulette, Peterson, and Braun. We see you. Please keep being strong education advocates. We appreciate it.
So the cap removal is a great civil rights win, and it will increase funding to some districts depending on how many kids getting special ed services they have. But the biggest issue with funding in our state is not actually the cap. I actually looked up the Seattle numbers, and as of the last monthly budget report attached to the school board meeting for April, there were 568 students out of 8,479 that were above the 16% cap.
Which is amazing. It is mind-boggling to me that we had this piece of policy in place that were like, cool, there's 8,479 disabled students that need funding, but we're just not going to fund 568 of them because there's too many disabled students. That is wild. That was something that we did. So super happy that's gone.
Yep. So 568 additional Seattle public schools students will be funded next year to the same inadequate level as the rest of the students getting services. Monetarily speaking, what we want to look at is the underfunding per student, and that's called the multiplier.
The multiplier did go up, so that's good.
Right now, the multiplier is 1.12x if you're more than 80% in the gen ed classroom, and 1.06 if you're less than 80% in the gen ed classroom.
Yep. The original Senate bill had raised the multiplier all the way up to 1.5289. That's the original Peterson-Braun bill. But it just kept getting chipped away and chipped away and chipped away. And in the end, the multiplier landed at 1.16 across the board. There's not that bifurcation anymore.
Yes. It's also static across, I think, preschool and pre-K. There had been so many different numbers, and I think they're trying to bring them all into one multiplier.
All right.
So now we have 1.16 as opposed to the 1.12 or 1.06. So it's better. And that marginal increase is the main source of the funding increase.
Yes. The third area that provides a significant funding increase is the safety net. Funding provided for students whose costs are significantly above average.
So the safety net currently kicks in if costs are 2.0x for small districts and 2.2x for large districts. This threshold is being lowered to 1.8 and 2.0.
All right. Additionally, it was agreed that in certain circumstances, the payments will be made quarterly, which will be a big help for some districts because the payments are reimbursements for funds already spent.
Okay, so those are the three areas of this budget that bring in the most additional money to districts. The multiplier, the removal of the cap, and the lowering of the threshold for the safety net funds.
Yes.
And let's break down how much came from each of these three pieces. So $309.6 million in new funds allocated by the state legislature towards special education over the biennium. $193 million of that money came from the increase of the multiplier. Eliminating the cap is sending the districts $81.7 million over the biennium, and lowering the threshold for safety net results in an additional $35 million over the biennium. And another thing we didn't mention yet that came from a separate bill is that $12.4 million is being appropriated to provide special education services to students through the end of the year when they turn 22.
Yes. And just as a friendly reminder, so this is the new money. This isn't like all of what is spent. So it's like the maintenance level of what we have now, and then this is added to the top for the next biennium.
Yeah, we've been talking, all these numbers are about filling the gap money. So now we'll just talk about some of the other features that did end up in the final special ed bill. One is this big new concept that gives the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, OSPI, a set aside from special ed funds. So first of all, OSPI is kind of like the statewide central office. They distribute money to schools, they collect data, they manage projects. This set aside that the legislature has invented is a way for the legislature to give OSPI money without having to spend more money themselves. What this does is it takes 0.6% of funding that would go to districts for special education and sends it to OSPI. And that's actually a good thing because it gives OSPI money to do things like reducing restraint and eliminating isolation or helping schools do inclusion. But just to be clear, it is coming out of district special education allocations.
Mm-hmm. All right. What is the carve-out? What has happened with that?
The carve-out has been there a long time, and I think very few people understand it. It's just another trick for the legislature to send less money to districts, as far as I can tell. It basically means that the first 25% of the money going to districts for special ed is just shifted from their general ed allocation. There was a really important fix, though, because of the way that it had been structured. There was actually an incentive to districts to do less inclusion. They fixed that.
All right. In addition, the legislature is providing direct funds for grants to a handful of schools to get a higher special ed multiplier to do inclusionary practices. So they would get 1.5x instead of 1.16 if they're doing these inclusionary practices, just for a handful of schools with these, or districts with these pilot programs.
Nope, schools.
Oh, 20 schools.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's individual schools. It's very small.
Okay. Yeah.
Also, really importantly, something that I was definitely keeping my eye on is the statewide IEP. OSPI is told to, from those funds that were set aside, to develop a statewide IEP system. And I think this is going to make it much easier to track what's going on in special education, to standardize, and to make improvements.
Yes. What about MSOC? So the headline here is that our MSOC bill, 5192, did pass, was another one that got eroded every time it got over a hoop or got to a new committee. And in the end, the MSOC bill would add just $78.9 million for districts in the upcoming biennium. That is a paltry $39.96 per student. That is on top of adjustments for inflation and the maintenance level that's already in there. So legislators are probably going to try to pull some tricks. Do not be misled when legislators claim that they provided $81 for K-12 students, because that's what they're already obligated to provide.
And then transportation?
We got nothing. Nothing for transportation.
Okay, so those are the big three. We want to talk about a couple of other bills that impact education funding that came up very late in the session. So they have high numbers. Remember, they started at 1,000, right? So these are 2049 and 2050.
Yes. So House Bill 2049 came in when the governor, I think, said he would not support some of the taxes that the legislature initially wanted to propose for new revenue to fill this budget hole.
And initially, there were three components. There was an increase in the statewide property tax, which goes into the state and gets redistributed out to the districts. That state property tax increase has been limited to grow by only 1% a year. And 2049 would have increased it to 3% per year, still well below inflation. The second part was lifting the local levy lid by quite a lot and eventually equalizing the levy lid between large districts and small districts. And then the third component of 2049 was an increase in local effort assistance, or LEA, which is there because even if you have the same levy lid for all districts, that doesn't mean that they can all raise the same amount of money. It costs a lot more per house if you are in a property poor district. Local effort assistance is supposed to equalize out that. Initially, that was the idea. But in reality, it's provided way less money than property wealthy districts can raise from their local levies. And then what happened is the legislators completely nixed the state property tax part, and they nixed the local effort assistance part from the bill, leaving only the lift of the levy lid, which mostly impacts property wealthy districts like Seattle. We probably don't need to go into all the details, but we have heard that this will bring approximately $25 million into Seattle this year. So it is by far the biggest chunk of money that will be coming into Seattle Public School District is from this local levy lid lift.
Yes.
They did put a small local effort assistance increase in a budget proviso.
Yes. And while the local levy lid increase is almost 60%, almost 30% for districts with more than 40,000 students over the next 6 years, LEA increases by about 25% over the next 2 years. And very confusingly, it is tied to a different inflationary factor. The inflationary adjustment for just the levies is tied to the CPI, or Consumer Price Index. But for LEA, they are tying it to the IPD, which is another inflationary factor, implicit price deflator. The upshot here is that IPD is not as good a measure as CPI for this type of thing. And it just doesn't make any sense to use two different inflationary factors. But I was given to understand that they ended up going with IPD because they needed to have a fiscal note on this bill that like they could do, right? Like they didn't want to have to kill the bill. So this was like their workaround for that.
Bottom line, though, the inequities between property rich and property poor districts will continue to widen. And I was pleased to see that in testimony when the removal of the LEA was in Ways and Means, there was a lot of strong testimony.
I am Charlie Brown. I'm here today on behalf of the South Sound Superintendents. I sent to you today a letter in opposition to this bill. We're opposed to it just because it does eliminate the LEA funding in the bill. I would ask that members, you at least match the original LEA funding in your budget, if that's the way you're going to do it, to what 2049 originally had. It was about $193 million in levy equalization. That would help those districts that simply cannot afford to ask their voters for more dollars.
I'm Melissa Gomboski on behalf of Evergreen Public Schools in the 49th Legislative District. We do oppose this bill because of the lack of LEA. It was in the bill. It was removed. There were amendments offered. They were rejected.
Devin Gomboski on behalf of ESD 105 Schools Coalition. Please do not advance this bill without restoring equitable LEA funding. Any proposal the legislature moves forward should serve all of our 1.1 million students across our 295 school districts.
I feel like people are really banding together behind the idea that the state should be funding basic education, and we are not just going to fight for our own district to raise more money because it's easy for us. We're going to all fight together to educate the kids of our state.
Yes, I love that too. Coalitions, it's what it's all about.
Another thing in that Ways and Means committee that really amused me and is also educational, I think, was that there was an amendment at the last minute to add in a work group to do a study on K-12 funding equity. And multiple testifiers said, get that study out of there.
I'm Julie Salvi with Washington Education Association. Just to flag the study that's in the budget, we've had a lot of studies in the state. We have a lot of solutions that we know we need to implement, and we would call on action rather than further studies.
I'm Melissa Gomboski. I do agree with my colleague at the Washington Education Association and ask for an amendment that removes the study in this bill. We have studied this to death. OSPI has not been resourced appropriately. They've been underfunded. We don't need another study. We respectfully ask for that.
Devin Gomboski. We also urge you to remove the study provision in this bill. We've had months of studies, and our students no longer have time to wait. They need action now.
So, note to all of the younger advocates, studies can be good, but they can also be a way to kick the can down the road.
Yeah, especially for this one. Like, I don't think you need to do a study to figure out why allowing a 60% increase for the levy lid, but only 25% for LEA, and then tying it to a different, lesser inflationary factor. Like, we don't need a lot of studying to know that this is going to exacerbate inequities.
Yep. There was one last-minute win. 2050 was a bill that was going to shift apportionment to basically save the state money temporarily. It wouldn't save the state any money in the long run, but make things harder for districts by shifting payments from some months to other months.
Yes. And so apportionment is enrollment numbers, staffing formulas, salaries, MSOC. After you run all of these formulas for your district, you're apportioned a certain amount of money. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about apportionments. But what the legislature was going to do was just be like, okay, we're not going to give you your apportionments for this school year now. We're going to wait until the next fiscal year. So on paper, it looks like we're spending less here and more there, but you're really getting the same amount. But this doesn't work because this is the money you need for like salaries and paying your bills. So what would have happened is districts would have to borrow money to get this paid, and that involves paying interest. So it would make the legislatures balance their budget on paper, but in reality, you're generating more financial hardship for school districts, which is not what they need right now.
You're basically just using the school districts as kind of like quick cash. And offensively, that bill was titled Implementing K-12 Savings and Efficiencies. and did not append for the state.
Yes. But 3 chairs, the apportionment shift, as Christie mentioned, that got axed. So thank you, June Robinson, Chair of Ways and Means.
Yeah. One piece still remains, which is going to be very difficult for a handful of districts. It's kind of difficult to explain this.
Yeah. Alphabet soup.
Basically, less funding will go to some districts that have alternative learning environments, especially small districts. And this is one of the few areas where there's still some advocacy around it. I think you said that there's a letter to ask the governor to veto this, right?
Yep. So in the spirit of coalitions, members of the Big Three coalition sent a letter to Governor Ferguson asking him to veto this because it would only provide, I think, $8 or $9 million in quote unquote savings for a 70-something billion dollar operating budget. It wouldn't affect SPS, but it would really decimate about, I think there's 8 school districts that would just get hit really hard by this. So we can attach it in the show notes.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of leads into, we have this great coalition. We've learned that our legislature is not too keen on funding education despite our best efforts. And so what do we do right immediately now?
Right immediately now, and I'm not even kidding, take a nap. Rest up. Recharge, because burnout is so real. And I think particularly doing this kind of advocacy work, it's really easy to get burnt out. And without our advocacy work this session, I don't think we would have gotten any new money. So everybody who's listening, like, what you do matters. Your advocacy matters. Like, rest up, recharge. And I know that's what, like, all the lobbyists and legislators are doing. They are exhausted. So we too, rest, recharge, let the dust settle. That's immediately now what we do. Mm-hmm. The next thing we do, I think, is kind of also in that quote unquote strategic self-care area, which is make friends. So take a nap, rest up, get up, and go make some friends or renew some friendships and acquaintances. Advocacy is a numbers game, and it's really important to build this strong community and build a strong coalition because you need that to do really tough multi-year projects like this one, especially. So you could think of it like, oh, I'm getting pizza and a pint with the friends I've made and my PTA for advocacy, and we're just like letting off steam, and it's just a fun thing. And also that is a very good strategic advocacy decision because you're forming bonds with your fellow advocates and you're building up your capacity and your network for next year. So take a nap, make some friends. Those are my 2 initial recommendations.
All right. So we'll take a nap, we'll make some friends, then we'll start talking with our friends. And then we will come back together to do an autopsy of the session and what we've learned and how we can change our advocacy to be more effective and take the alliances that we've built and be more impactful next year. So that's the game plan.
Yeah, the Big Three coalition lives on. I know legislators and folks in leadership, after they get up from their nap, they're going to start strategizing. And we will too. We all just need a little bit of distance and rest. So the game isn't over. It's not going to be over till we get all the money we need. And I think this is largely going to boil down to a question of political will. But we'll come back. We'll tackle this problem. We will develop the political will we need to get this done.
And that's a wrap for the 2025 legislative session. Thanks for joining us for these 14 episodes of the Big Three Briefing. And I want to give a really huge shout out to Megan Larkin, who was truly the power and inspiration for this series. We've heard from so many listeners that this series has made a big impact on their ability to follow the legislative process, to understand, and to make advocacy more accessible.
Yes, I've heard this as well. And thank you for everybody who has listened, and thank you to Christie for doing this session. I know she puts in a lot of work, like all of those beautiful show notes and the amazing audio clips. Like, this is Christie's blood, sweat, and tears. So thank you so much, Christie. I know this series has really made a huge difference for a lot of people.
Yay.
So we're going to rest up a bit, but we've heard some ideas from our listeners for follow-on episodes, such as how federal changes are impacting Washington schools.
Yes, or what interim work looks like how do you go from a problem statement to getting a bill passed? Those are for another day. Let us know what you think at big3@rainydayrecess.org.
You can find show notes and transcripts at rainydayrecess.org.
Stay curious, stay cozy, and thanks for listening to Rainy Day Recess.